Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the March 27th, 2019 Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, Placer County Airport Land Use Commission, the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency, and the annual meeting of the Americans who feel good about themselves. We'll begin today with a flag salute. Will you please join me in saluting our flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Will the clerk be kind enough to call the roll?
Allard.
Here.
Broadway.
Here.
Burris.
Present.
Clark Kretz. Gore.
Here.
Holmes.
Here.
Joyner. Mackey. Wright.
Everything okay? Oh,
Right now, we have a motion.
already. Thank you. Looks like we have a quorum. And now, everybody, we get to go to closed session in conference room A, conference with legal counsel, existing litigation of subdivision government code 5956-9. Name of case, Sierra Club versus Caltrans, PCTPA, and others. Shall we adjourn to closed session? Stage right. Thank you, everyone. The agency board of directors has just returned from closed session. We had a conference with legal counsel and staff regarding the item identified in item C on Sierra Club versus Caltrans PTCPA et al. And we gave direction to staff. That concludes our closed session report. And now we'll move to item D, approval of action minutes, February 27th, 2019.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the action minutes of February 27th, 2019. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, any abstentions? Hearing none. We'll move to agenda review. That's item E. Anything on the agenda that needs clarification or
Sir, we have no change in the agenda today.
any changes? All right, thank you. Now is the time for public comment. Anyone that wishes to address the board on any item that is not on the agenda, now is the time to come forward and speak your piece. You'll have 3 minutes. Anyone want to talk to us under public comment? Okay, we will close public comment and move to item G, consent calendar for the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. Any items on the consent calendar need to be removed for discussion? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion.
Make a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the consent calendar for the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, any abstentions? The item is moved. Now we'll do the consent calendar for the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency. Any items on this consent calendar need to be pulled out for discussion? Seeing none.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the consent calendar for the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the item is moved. We'll now move to item I. This is a public hearing for the Airport Land Use Commission Placer County Government Center Master Plan Update Consistency Review Determination. Mr. Melko.
Yes, members of the board. Today we have the Placer County Government Center Master Plan Update Consistency Determination requested by Placer County Planning and Facilities Management. So we have a PowerPoint here that hopefully we'll be able to walk through and keep the process a little bit briefer and smoother. So just by way of background for members of the commission here that are new to the PCTPA board, the Airport Land Use Commission is required to adopt and maintain land use compatibility plans. We have land use compatibility plans for Blue Canyon Airport, Auburn Municipal Airport, and Lincoln Regional Airport. These were adopted in 2014. The role of the commission is to review changes to plans, general plan amendments, specific plan amendments, specific plans, zoning changes, rezone, zoning text amendments, building regulations, all within the airport influence area of the airports. As part of your role in looking at airport land use compatibility, and as part of our role as your staff, we look at 4 factors for compatibility. Those factors are noise, safety, airspace protection, and overflight. Now, because we have land use in the title of the Airport Land Use Commission, and when we hold public hearings, we get a number of people who come here, excuse me, to address a number of land use issues that don't necessarily fall within those 4 factors. Those land use issues are appropriate to be addressed at either City Planning Commission or County Planning Commission, and at the City Council or Board of Supervisor as part of your role as reviewing project development applications. But here we're limited to these 4 factors. So this board has 3 choices in making a consistency determination on land use compatibility. We can find the project consistent with the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan, consistent with the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan subject to conditions, or inconsistent based on specific conflicts. I will point out that today we are focusing on the Auburn Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan with respect to the Placer County Government Center Master Plan. So a brief overview of the master plan update process and as it relates to the Airport Land Use Commission. So the draft master plan was released in November, and the EIR was also released in November. February 22nd, the county submitted their Airport Land Use application to the ALUC. We put together a meeting with county staff and with City of Auburn staff to review the land use application to the ALUC, as well as to have a meeting to kind of go over the entire county government center master plan, the design guidelines, the development standards. And out of that meeting, there were, it was a good meeting. There were a number of questions raised by Auburn staff as well as ourselves. And some of the questions that were asked by the Auburn staff are addressed in attachment 5 within the staff report. And those dealt with the location of housing and the occupants of the housing, of the multifamily housing in the C2 zone. Today, we're holding a public hearing, and in the future, there will be planning entitlements, and I believe the project will go to the County Planning Commission here in March and the Board of Supervisors in April. So for those who are not necessarily familiar with the location, hopefully everybody is. It's a 200-acre campus west of State Route 49 between Bell Road and Atwood. And it occupies what is presently sometimes called the DeWitt Center. And in terms of the master plan, this is a conceptual master plan provided by the county planning staff. There are 2 compatibility zones that overlay the campus, the C2 zone and Zone D. The C2 zone has some restrictions with respect to height and intensity density standards. The Zone D, basically, there are really very few limits with respect to land use projects. So in looking at the master plan and as it relates to the 2 compatibility zones, Zone C2 and Zone D, in terms of noise, it's consistent. The noise contours for this airport, the 55 decibel noise contour is further to the east, and so the campus is outside that decibel, 55 decibel contour. The safety issues, there are no safety issues. In Zone C2, there are limits in terms of the number of people on the ground, in terms of intensity, density. Their average is 200 people per acre. And in Zone C2, you have residential, you have 3 acres there, so you could have up to 600 people on that particular multifamily parcel. The proposal within the application is far less number of people, so it's consistent. In Zone D, there are no limits, and so it's consistent safety-wise there. Airspace protection, it's pretty much deals with height regulation. And in Zone C2, the height regulation is any building that's above 70 feet needs to go through an FAA airspace review. In Zone D, it's 150 feet. The design guidelines proposed for the master plan have a limit of 50 feet. And so there's no issue with airspace protection. On overflight in Zone C2, because you have multifamily residential, the multifamily residential may be exposed to, notwithstanding that it's outside the noise contour, singular noise events. And in that regard, state law requires that there is notification to any potential residents that there is an airport 1.2 miles away. And so that runs with the residential property. In addition, the airport land use compatibility plan for all of the airports recommends that in Zone D, while not required by state law, the plan recommends that there be notification to both residential and non-residential tenants, and it's called an airport proximity disclosure. And in that regard, it's a notice that, it's distributed as part of employee packets, as part of, to the owner. It can be posted as signage that there is an airport and that occasionally there will be singular noise events with respect to air traffic. And so with that, we have a recommendation regarding the overflight notification for these tenants. And so the staff recommendation is that we find that the project is consistent with the airport land use compatibility plan for Auburn, subject to conditions, the condition being the overflight notification. And your next steps is to conduct a public hearing and to make a consistency determination, and there's a staff recommendation. And I will note that there is county staff here today. Paul Breckenridge, the project manager for the master plan process, is here to address any questions that I am unable to answer with respect to the project. And with that, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Milko. Any questions for staff? Before, is that you? Ms. Moore?
Yes, one question. As far as residential in C2 areas for the existing airport area, how much residential is in C2, and has that been a problem?
I believe well, under the plan, there's a 3-acre multifamily residential proposal, and on those 3 acres, you could have up to 600 residents on those 3 acres. I believe the proposal with the county is to have 70 dwelling units, and there's like
Right.
less
I
than
think
3
the
people.
question is, I know what the current plan is for the master plan. I know that
Right.
there's the Mercy Housing Project. In other areas of the airport's footprint,
Right.
like C2 over here off of maybe Bell Road, north of Bell Road, there's an area of residential, right?
Correct.
So there are other areas of residential in C2 zones for the airport. Has it been a problem? The noise, well, actually, the issue isn't the noise, the issue was the overflight, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
So existing uses, we don't have any, so this gets kind of complicated in people in terms of the role of the Airport Land Use Commission. The role of the Airport Land Use Commission is to look at new development and to make sure that new development is consistent with the compatibility plan or any modifications to existing development. So existing development in and of itself, and where people have come forward in the past with noise complaints issues, we really don't have a role in addressing that. That role is best addressed locally by the city or county in terms of their noise ordinances, and in this case, the city being the owner-operator of the airport. And of course, there's some FAA restrictions on how airports and flight patterns can be dealt with. We've had noise issues in the past. When the plan was adopted in 2014, this place was packed with a number of people from North Auburn and the Meta Vista area complaining about noise issues. And we tried to address those in the delineation of the zones. But we haven't pleased everybody.
You answered my question, so
Okay.
we're talking about new development, not
existing development.
Existing
right,
development,
correct.
thank you.
Director Mackey.
Bear with me, Mr. Malcolm. This is new to me.
Okay.
But I would like to address the airspace protection issue.
Okay.
I understand that there might be a very tall building built there if the C is moved southwest a bit. Zone C might be moved a bit southwest. I read in some of the documents that that's a possibility. And there's nothing referred to as far as the elevation. It just talks about building height. And the building height from the airport to C2 zone might be a different height. So Part 77 says that it has to be 1,689 feet above mean sea level. And that's not addressed in your document at all.
Well, the master, so the site basically ranges from slightly less than around 1,380 feet to somewhere to 1,430 feet. So it depends upon the grade of the 200 acres. So it is beneath the airspace protection surfaces for that area. And so the plan has both 150 feet for zone D and 70 feet in zone C. So it takes into account the existing terrain heights. And so assuming that any proposal comes forward and stays within those height limits, it's consistent with the plan. Now, if a proposal comes forward and exceeds those heights, then the applicant is required, or we would recommend to the county in this instance, that the applicant undergo an FAA airspace review. Now, the FAA airspace review may come back and say, yes, it's an obstruction, but it's not a hazard to airspace. And so at that point in time, this is once again a theoretical assumption, assuming that there's a building exceeding those heights, then the ALUC would then need to make a determination as to whether or not they would find that project consistent or inconsistent based upon those set of conditions.
And you can't put that wording regarding Flight 77 in this attachment under airspace protection.
If the board would like to include that as a condition, that's the board's prerogative. At this point in time, the design guidelines for the project cap the height limits to 50 feet. And so we're working on the project proposal that's before us, and based on the project proposal before us, the proponent, the applicant, the county is saying that heights are going to be limited to 50 feet. And so in that regard, we're finding it consistent.
At this time.
At this time, yeah. And if there is a change to the master plan at some point in the future, that change in the master plan would then need to come back before this board for further review. And so at that point in time, the board would then weigh in on that particular change. And if the change dealt with a particular change in heights or a relocation of a building or a change in a building height, and once again, if they exceeded the 70 feet or the 150 feet, depending upon the zone it was in, then we would need to make a determination at that point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from directors before I open it up to public comment? Seeing none, it's a public hearing. I'll open it up to the public. Anyone from the public wish to address the agency board on this item? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing, bring it back to the board for action.
I'll move that we approve the item as staff has recommended, consistent with the Airport Land Use Commission, or Airport Land Use Plan, subject to conditions.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved to second to approve the item as staff has recommended. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you. The item is moved. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. Appreciate it. We'll now move to item, thank you, everyone, for for this item. Thanks, Mr. Melko.
Thank you.
Good job. Now we'll move to item J, SACOG Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainability Community Strategic Strategy Elected Officials Presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the Board of Directors. This item this morning is a continuation of our November 14th special meeting discussion related to the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and the Sustainable Community Strategy and our Regional Transportation Plan. We were requested by SACOG to again hold a community meeting and invite elected officials from throughout the county to our meeting, but we have made a commitment to not duplicate the discussion that happened on the 14th of November. I think all of the members of the board present today were in attendance at that meeting, and so we're going to pick up where that left off and make our presentation on current items and where we're moving from this point forward. So James Corliss with SACOG is going to be going through a PowerPoint presentation to you and answering any questions that you have today.
Good morning, Mr. Corliss.
Good morning, Board. Again, James Corliss, Executive Director of SACOG. Thanks very much for your time this morning. It's good to see a number of the crossover board members. I just want to also recognize the four, I think we have four in the audience here, Directors Douglas, Onderco, Gallardo, and Spokley. And I would be remiss not to mention our former board chair, Susan Rohan. So thanks very much. And as Mike set this up, this is really a continuation, a check-in for all of you in terms of where the regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy is at. My goal is to make this slightly less complicated than your previous item. I'll see if I can actually achieve that for you, because this is a really, really important plan. While it gets technical and there's lots of numbers and data and analysis, this really is about the future of the six-county region, how we grow, how we invest in transportation, how we can afford that, and how we can achieve economic prosperity at the same time. We are driving towards an adoption of this plan by February 2020. Next month, just next week actually, the SACOG board will begin a process of adopting a preferred scenario, which is really our final scenario that then gets into analysis and EIR and then gets released again in the fall for a final round of public comment and public review before we go to adoption in February of 2020. I think you've heard this before, but I'll say it several times this morning. Among the many things we're trying to achieve with this plan, which is not just a great competitive region with a great quality of life that's second to none in the nation, we're trying to achieve a greenhouse gas reduction target of 19% per capita by 2035 from a 2005 base year from mobile sources. So from the transportation sector in the 6 counties, we are trying to show a plan that will prove 19% reduction per capita from the transportation sector by 2035. The last plan cycle we had a 16% target for the same horizon year. So same horizon year, we need 3 extra percentage points. And it is not simply an academic exercise. As I've told our board, if we don't hit this target, we will be put into what's called an alternative planning strategy, or an APS. And more importantly, we will become ineligible for some of the state competitive funding rounds. SB1 congested corridors, which this region has done very well in the last cycle, and which we're hoping things like the 8065 project could do well in future cycles. So I hope now that I have your attention, I'll go through some slides. So this is basically kind of the ingredients behind this, and I want to just emphasize, and I know you've heard this before, because you all are creating your own regional transportation plan, and because we are making efforts at every step of the way to sync together the RTP for Placer County, the MTPSCS for the 6 counties. A, you've heard this before, but B, it's really critical that we're not on separate paths, that we're actually on coordinated paths. And we're doing the best we can to do that. I think we've had a lot of really good back and forth with your staff and many of the electeds in Placer County, I'd say in the last 6 months, and things have changed. So part of what I'm doing this morning is to tell you where we are and what's changed and what we've heard from your communities. So here's sort of the ingredient list. Again, this is not simply just a a look at transportation projects. That's the MTP portion of this, but it is based on an economic forecast for the next 25 years, and it is also based on a land use forecast. And that is where we have a lot of discussion, a lot of dialogue back and forth with different communities and jurisdictions. And sometimes it gets tense, but it's really important because the transportation network that we invest in is only as good as the growth patterns and the jobs housing that we get in the region. And while we recognize that is about the private sector, and the private sector's ability to develop and create jobs and grow houses, you all and we all do have an influence on where that happens and the phasing of housing, jobs, and infrastructure, which is what's so important in a plan like this. In the transportation budget, the third kind of item down there, I will give you a theme, which as a longtime transportation person does not make me popular, but one of the things we have to grapple with in these 6 counties, it's no different really than other places around the country, is we do not have the revenues that we thought we might have just 10 years ago. The federal government does not have a stable long-term plan for federal funding in transportation. The good news in California is we rely less and less on federal funding, which is why your sales tax measure is so important in Placer County and Sacramento County, but it's still a key piece. Our revenues are stable, they are shaky, they are uncertain, and we have to do more to basically shore those up. But in terms of the asks and everything that we want to build the next 25 years, we don't have the money to pay for that. So I would suggest to you that, and the board has established longstanding policy, the first order of business is to fix what we have, make sure we're maintaining our existing network, and then to make very smart, strategic, targeted investments in new capacity, because we can't do it all. And I'm going to talk about performance outcomes a little bit. The greenhouse gas 19% target is what we all focus on. But again, we're trying to make sure that we understand there are other really important performance indicators for this plan, right? And as we grow in the future. Reduction in heavy congestion in terms of per capita, how much traffic you experience. More mobility, more accessibility, and I'll name some of those. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the implementation. The plan gets adopted in February 2020, but we already have to figure out, okay, so what does it mean to actually implement this plan? What does that look like? So again, the good news is we are forecasting, and we're being pretty conservative, we think, with this forecast. We are forecasting strong growth for this region. We are forecasting growth that outpaces the growth of California. We are forecasting strong job growth and housing growth. That, by the way, if you add up all our general plans across the 6 counties, we have way more supply than we actually have demand. And so that is one of our challenges as a regional agency, is to basically figure out not all those general plans are going to come to fruition by 2035 or 2040, so where do we think that growth will happen? That is the art of putting together the land use forecast. But when I give you these numbers and I give you these forecasts, let's just talk about housing for a second. If you average out the homes over the life of the plan, we're talking roughly about 11,000 housing starts per year. We've been at about between 5 and 7, as we've picked up a little bit from the recession, but we're in a deficit, right? So this is not a plan that constrains growth. This is a plan that forecasts a lot more growth, but the supply of all our general plans are way up here, and here's where we think we would be, and we'd be happy to be in terms of demand and what we can produce the next 20 years. The shape of this growth, the land use pattern, as I've said, is really important. It's the underpinning of how we invest in transportation. It is fundamentally based on the original blueprint document from 2004. And I think we have to have a very important discussion about that blueprint document, because I think we're seeing some signs that maybe we're not holding to what we voluntarily said we would do back in 2004. We can put a pin in that, and we can come back to that later. This is a plan, as it has been, as the blueprint itself is, but this SCS is really a plan that looks at balanced growth. It looks at growth in what we call established center and corridor communities, urban, but also some suburban infill. It looks at suburban growth, and it looks at exurban growth, but it looks at a balance among all of those things, because that balance is really, really important. We're looking at small lot and attached homes. And we are forecasting, and our blueprint suggests we need to do more in terms of multifamily, small lot, single family, attached product. And we know this is a market issue right now, and some of that multifamily is coming back. It's starting, we're starting to see that kind of housing production, but not nearly as much as we think we need in the region to meet demand and to meet the SES. And then some large lot and rural residential. I mentioned the transportation budget and the reality, the stark reality that we have a gap between what we say we need to invest in and actually how much revenue we have. This is across the 6 counties. I want to be really clear. So our budget for this plan right now is holding at about $33 billion. If you add up all the requests from project sponsors of the 6 counties, we're at about 46. So that's a $13 billion gap. So we can do 2 things there. One is we can reduce that cost and that ask, or we can increase the revenues, right? Those are essentially the 2 things that we can do. But we are trying to scale down and match right now what we think our budget is at $33 billion to all the requests we've had, and we've been doing that very actively with a lot of your staff. And some of that is about making projects into sort of pre-development and planning. Some of that is pushing some projects out beyond the horizon year. A couple of tables here with lots of numbers, so if you have questions, please let me know. In terms of the shape of growth and where we forecast this growth to happen, and if you can see those are the community types there on the left-hand side, centers and corridors, established communities, those are basically the communities, urban, suburban, and rural, that are on the ground today, developing greenfield and rural residential. For the region, for the 6 counties, looking at our forecast in terms of new, what's coming, right? Those larger numbers, 260,000, 270,000. Here's how the jobs shape up right now. So across the region, most of that jobs and housing we're targeting for what we call established communities, but quite a bit, 30 and 33% in these centers and corridors. These are not just your downtown Sacramento infill, I want to emphasize this. These are your old retail corridors, your old commercial corridors, your Auburn Boulevards, your Folsom Boulevards. Those are centers and corridors identified by your local communities where we would really believe we need to see more development happen, revitalization, more infill. We are not forecasting, as you can see if you go over to the Placer County side, nearly as much, right? So we recognize your pattern, the shape of your growth. You're a newer community, you're a fast-growing community. You're going to be growing more in established and developing areas, but that just gives you some sense of the region versus Placer County. So let's talk a little bit about numbers in terms of the plan. So those are the existing, these are heavily rounded, but existing 26 numbers for all of your communities, jobs and housing. And then looking out at the growth to 2040. You'll note that I mentioned 2035 as this greenhouse gas reduction target. That's that state target that gives us that horizon year of 2035. The plan itself goes out to 2040. So growth in jobs, growth in housing across each of the communities. Happy to share this PowerPoint with you if you need to get some of these numbers. Again, happy to share it with you. So you don't have to write it all down, but I could pause. I'll keep going. Okay, so transportation investments. Again, we started this process really about 18 months ago in sync with your staff here at PCTPA. We start all of these really as we kind of start with the previous plan. We start with a discussion draft on land use, a discussion draft on transportation, and we've had lots of back and forth, especially in Placer County, about your growth, about your general plans, about what your staff sees happening, development projects, things that are on the horizon, things you think will break ground. On the transportation side, the same exact thing. So I know that your staff here can give you more detail on this, but at a high level, there were about 53 projects that were not in our original discussion draft for Placer County that are now in the preferred scenario for the SACOG MTP SES that syncs up with your RTP. That's about a total of $7 billion in investment, and about $1 billion of those projects to basically scale the plan to this budget, either outside of the plan now. I would say outside the plan, in for project development. So doing environmental, clearing those hurdles, moving along, but not yet looked and budgeted in there for construction or removed outside the ultimate horizon year of the plan for 2040. I know that you've had some discussion, and we have at the SACOG board, about what we call pricing strategies. We are one of the largest, if not the largest, metropolitan region in the United States with no form of pay-as-you-go whatsoever. Most regions around the country will have express lanes. You can pay to go in those express lanes. Those are not usually a daily thing. They are a mechanism of getting it. They're basically, usually they're HOV lanes that get converted to a toll lane. So you're selling off extra capacity if those HOV lanes are not actually full with people. And then you use, I know you've had the managed lanes, I think presentation from Caltrans. This is what this is. I think it's highly, well, I'll say I've been here for 2 years. It's very unusual. I'm sort of startled by the fact that we don't have express lanes. If you look at, I mentioned the federal government and what they're doing on transportation. I can tell you that where they're heading, while we want to make sure we keep grant programs alive, they're heading to loan programs. They're heading to rewards for regions that actually either help themselves with sales taxes or do more pricing strategies. Another reason I think we need to be seriously looking at this. But these kinds of express lanes, managed lanes, toll lanes can also, if we build a network, and you probably know this, you try to drive on an HOV lane into downtown Sacramento, you can't do it because they stop. Long story behind that, but we've got an SB1 congested corridor grant to finally complete that HOV lane. If you can convert the HOV lanes to a regional network of express lanes, you can get where you need to go. If you're late for childcare and you're going to get penalized, this is why people use these express lanes. And I think very importantly, you can actually begin to build a regional express bus network using a network of express lanes. So think of this as your fixed guideway, your very much cheaper form of building rail around the region in the form of a toll lane, express lane, and running very fast and frequent buses down there. More to come on that later. The plan is also looking at, because we have to, what comes after the gas tax. And I know this is not without controversy, SB1, Proposition 6. But in 2035 and 2040, the horizon year of this plan, we do not believe that the gas tax is going to be the way that we generate revenue for transportation. So we believe it's upon us as a region to think creatively about what comes next. That's a really important question. It's a hard question, but it relates exactly to that budget that I gave you earlier. And so we would like, as one of the ways to implement this plan, to frankly beginning to be doing some pilot projects with our residents around the region. What's a way of paying for the transportation system that makes sure we're reinvesting it in the transportation network, and essentially, and this is the hard one, is fair. Is fair not just across mode of travel, but actually is fair across urban, suburban, and rural. I can certainly say more about that, but we're doing a lot of work on this, and I think it's, again, a huge opportunity for us in this region to kind of put our destiny in our hands and to get creative on pricing. Couple last slides. Back to the 19% greenhouse gas target, and I think our board has heard about this. When the state gave us this target a little over a year ago, we argued very strongly with them that they gave us a 90% target, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, and we said, we're not like any of those places. We're very different. Our economy is different. We don't have a robust transit network. We don't have a BART system. So if you want us to achieve this, and you say that these things are really important, you need to help us. You've taken away one of our main tools, redevelopment, and you haven't given us anything in exchange. So we're willing to actually be a bit of a pilot region. We're willing to actually figure out how can we actually expedite and streamline new housing and infill and centers and corridors, new travel options, make transit work in a suburban setting, microtrans, electric vehicles, but we need your help. You've got to partner with us. We can't do this alone. The Air Resources Board recognized that argument. They said there's validity. The Sacramento region is different. They gave us an asterisk, trying to convert that asterisk into something that's actually means something. But that's a pilot program that we've been working on with your jurisdictions called Green Means Go. The whole play on this, of course, is if we want to get to environmental results and benefits, we need to expedite, we need to accelerate infill, accelerate transit options, accelerate deployment of clean vehicles. We have a program that we are now going to the state legislature with. It is a budget request. We will need all of your help on this. And we did what's called a pre-application. So the state legislature I'm trying not to use too much of a characterization here, but basically said, really, the Sacramento region wants to step up and do interesting things and be a model? Prove to us that that's really the case, because we're focused on Los Angeles and the ports and San Francisco. We've had 25 of our 28 jurisdictions submit pre-applications for this program in this region. That is, I think it's outstanding. You all have put your hands up, and in Placer County, a vast majority of your jurisdictions had said, we're interested. We want some help. We don't want restrictions and regulations and a top-down, but we want something that's bottom-up that we can control, and we drive a sort of a race to the top. This is a high-risk strategy. I don't know if we'll get funding through the state budget, but I know that it is time for us as a six-county region to throw our weight around a little bit, to tell the folks in the legislature why we're special and different, why we're willing to test and pilot test things. I think that's one of our, frankly, that's one of our most, our best competitive advantages in the state capitol. So more on that to come. I'm hoping that we can deliver some funding for your communities and we can get some model projects up there, both in terms of housing and in terms of innovative transportation. Final calendar, steps in the process. Here we are coming up to April 2019. Board will adopt next month a preferred scenario and the assumptions, some of which I've given you at a high level today. As I mentioned, we have this window of time where we'll look at a draft plan and doing an EIR. That's a very, I know you know this, it's a very intensive process. We'll go out for public comment and review in September, and then final adoption in February 2020. And I just want to end on this last piece, which I think those of you that have seen the GSEC presentation, and even Barry and I have done some stuff together on this, I am convinced that we have had transportation in a silo for far too long. I think we need to reconnect transportation investments to the bigger question of what we're trying to accomplish. And I would suggest to you that I think what we're trying to accomplish is an economically prosperous and competitive region and a great quality of life that's second to none. I know that can be a little bit vague, but we are driving towards this. The Brookings Institution came in and did, I think, what I would call an economic stress test for our region. And they basically said, I got good news and bad news, but we do have some good news. We have to be intentional about our economic direction. We have to be intentional about our economic clusters. The fact that we don't want to be a state government town relying on government jobs, we have to be intentional about that. And I want our infrastructure investments and our agency in particular to really help support this emerging economic prosperity strategy. You'll hear more about this in the months to come, but I just want to end on this point to tell you that I certainly believe that in terms of workforce, in terms of job creation, innovation, I think we're the region that can, and I want this transportation plan to be the support mechanism for that very goal. I'd be delighted to answer any questions. Again, I don't know if any of my board members want to step up and say anything, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Corliss. Any members of the agency board wish to speak to this issue?
No, but I would like a copy of the PowerPoint.
You got it.
I think Trinity would too. Thank you.
I do have one quick question, and that is, James, for the Green Wings Go projects, what type of projects are the local jurisdictions bringing forth? I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
it's a great question. A vast array. So we just got the applications in. Happy to share with your staff. They are very sample projects. I'd just be sort of caution us. We made it very easy, very unlike government. We made a very simple, easy form. But we basically said, what would you here's the challenge, here's the categories. So for instance, we've got a number of multifamily affordable housing projects that actually have a financial gap and can't pencil. And some of that, sometimes those are requirements coming down from the state, sometimes those are fees. We've got a number that have regional sewer fees. I've got one that has water pressure issue that they can't. There was always water pressure for a single commercial use, never for a 4-story residential use. That's a major investment, and if you can do that in a greenfield area, generally speaking, right, you can put that across more people. If it's one by one-offs, it's really hard to make it happen. We got stormwater requirements. We've got traffic signal upgrade requirements, all on the housing side. I think on the transit side, this is the question the nut we have to crack, I think, which is there's no doubt in my mind that we need to make sure that we provide really good options and choices, whether it's Placer County, a rural area, or an urban area. Yet we're seeing transit ridership drop nationally across the region. and we're seeing fixed route just have a harder and harder time serve people to get where they need to go. So on-demand is far more enticing for people. We're having an experiment in West Sacramento with VIA, private provider that's come in and is doing some really interesting stuff in West Sacramento. That is not cheap. I want to just put the emphasis on it is far easier and cheaper to run a fixed route bus. However, if nobody rides it, it's a waste of money. So microtransit actually is something a lot of our smaller jurisdictions have actually come forward with. And then I think we've had a couple of electric vehicle deployment ideas. Again, these are sort of sketch level at this point, but I do think it's really it's been great to see how much creative thinking there is out there. Frankly, we've met with this administration, the Newsom administration, and we've said, look, rather than punish us by withholding transportation funds if we don't meet our housing numbers, which is the proposal on the table, reward us, put the carrot out there, right? Ask for creative ideas from the bottom up, because every community is different. So we think this might be, we hope, this is kind of the model for actually doing this ground up.
Mr. Holmes, if I may. James, under the theory of go big or go home, I've been curious, this pilot program, we don't currently have, and forgive me, Mike, if I scare you with this one, we don't currently have a funding source for the widening of Highway 65. We also don't currently have pricing anywhere in the region. What if that pilot program were to add 2 additional lanes to Highway 65 that are priced and have the state fund that? That would be the first in the region, and it would solve our problem of widening 65.
I'm game. I mean, I think I think we need to think about adding capacity and that's priced, that's managed, and I think that's the way. There's lots of work to do from a staff level in terms of toll revenue, demand, operations. Right? I don't want to say it's the panacea, but given the fact that we have nothing yet, and we would love to have folks step up and say this could be the answer. We'd like to explore this in a very deep way. I mentioned the sort of the implementation. We adopt an MTP and an RTP, but we need to implement those things. I think we should develop some sort of a proposal. I'm not, I obviously I'll let Mike say a few things here, but I think we need first out of the gate, right? Caltrans has got the managed lane study. This is a plan that goes out to 2040, but we need to see stuff on the ground. If you're interested in stepping up with a project and willing to actually think creatively about it in terms of managing it and putting express lanes in there, I think we should be working with you to figure out how we get that done.
So I think that, as James stated, there's probably some low-hanging fruit that we probably want to pursue in the first couple of years, but it's an ideal time to talk about this because we're actually designing the widening project right now. Luke is our project manager on that project, so that's something that we can certainly take into account. And once maybe some of these things, we get through these managed lanes things with Caltrans and the like, and get some of the bugs worked out and some of the systems worked out, that it could be a very viable project, and we can certainly take a look at it.
Thank you. Director Broadway.
Thank you. So James, a couple things. We're looking currently, the challenges we have, but you mentioned 2040 and the fact that the gas tax at that point in time, likely based on the analysis, isn't going to provide the support we need. We just heard that we don't have the funding to support some of the needs that we have relative to the widening. So we're constantly seeking ways to find those funds. So understanding that 2040, we're going to be at a point where we may not even have, through the current processes, any type of funding available. What is being done legislatively from your team, your office, to push to address that, to look at what is occurring and how we change, and we look to support that from a reinvestment in the infrastructure and improvement to what we currently have?
So because I can geek out on this, I'm trying to give you the Reader's Digest version. Oregon was the first state in the country to do a gas tax in 1919. They're the first state to try a pilot test about 4 years ago with a mileage traveled fee. Voluntary, lots of data, really interesting results. California has followed on, and I would recommend a presentation on the pilot program, whether that's the SACOG board or PCTPA, because there has been a couple of tests, right, in terms of actually getting these kind of pilot projects out there to sort of see how might you do it, because there's all kinds of questions about what this looks like, how you collect, do you read odometers, do you track people, right? I'm just going to say it, right, because that's the concern. So legislatively, yet I think we're about 5 to 7 years away from being in a serious enough place that we have to have a plan B. But if you back that up, it means we need to start now. And I would say, back to the implementation piece of this, I think we need a pilot program in the region that is region-wide, 6 counties, rural, suburban, and urban, to begin to test different ways of actually sort of pricing the system and scrapping the gas tax and going to something else, again, that's fair. And one of the things that, so legislatively, we do not have a push right now, because there is no push. There is a bill that we've actually tried to get onto, which actually authorizes some pilot programs for pricing, and we're trying to get in that mix so we get authorization, because you've got to get state authorization. So this is a good 3-year window, I think, for a push. But let me just suggest this to you, and I know it gets complicated, but on a mileage traveled fee, which some people think that is the future, that's what we're going to. We're going to scrap the gas tax and go to per mile traveled. And if you look at electric vehicles that then pay nothing right now into the gas tax, because we have a fee per year, right? That kind of came through SB 1, but it doesn't seem fair that an electric vehicle gets to just use the roads for free, right? But if I drive 50 miles on a rural 2-lane road because my doctor is 50 miles away, and I don't see a car, I don't pass a car that entire trip, but I jump on I-80 or US 50 at 9 a.m. in the morning, and suddenly that whole freeway breaks down. Those are 2 very different impacts to the transportation system, right? That second trip is hugely costly, because widening is going to be very costly, right? So is there a way that, much like the private sector, we can use pricing to both generate revenue but also manage demand? Is there a way we can work with employers in the next 5 years to flex work schedules, to do telework? What's the future of work? How do we incorporate these things and then actually have a pricing system that seems fair, generates revenue, is not unaffordable, because that is a real concern. One final piece I'll just mention, because I think this is really interesting. Right now, there's a lot of concern in rural areas about a mile traveled fee because the lengths are so long. If you simply flip right now, based on miles per gallon and efficiency of the fleet, and we know this now given a household travel survey we just did, if you flip the current state gas tax to a per mile fee, just equilibrium, just make it same kind of revenue, rural residents will actually pay less. Sounds counterintuitive, but they're paying more now because the average efficiency of the fleet in rural areas is much lower. So a per mile fee actually equalizes that and actually makes people pay less to consume the same amount of mobility, right? Because you're equalizing the MPGs to a mileage basis.
Right. Now, you mentioned the managed lane study. We actually had Caltrans with us at our last meeting to present information on that. Are you in sync as you work through this planning process with them? I know they talked with our team at PCTPA.
Yep.
Is that all coming together so that as you're looking at this, we're not going in the opposite direction?
We're not going in opposite directions, but I do think we've had some good conversations with Caltrans. I think we're looking further out, that's what I would say. Look out to 2035 and 2040. Their managed lane study is much more geographically defined and time bound, and what we have to do is think about 2040.
Okay.
But we're having those conversations.
Okay, perfect. And then my last question is, you spoke to the work that your team does, and then of course we have a wonderful staff here on our side that's putting together our plan as well. Are there any conflicts that this board needs to be aware of as you're working through that process?
No, the only difference between the two is that we are on a somewhat a slightly faster timeline. Our adoption will be at the end of this year in December, but otherwise it's we're working in lockstep with SACOG.
Great.
That's what we've been doing the last 6 months, is making sure we stand in front of you today without any conflicts.
Well, again, appreciated the November presentation, and it's great to see
Yeah.
groups working together. So thank you, James, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Bet. Any other comments from agency board members? I see none, but at this time, I'll open it up to the public. Anybody in the public wish to address the board on this amazingly interesting item? Seeing none, Mr. Corliss, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
presentation. We've really got our work cut out for us, but we all have to work together now, don't we? And we appreciate your leadership.
Indeed. Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move to item K, item K. I wrote over it so I couldn't see it. This is the overall work program and budget amendment number 2.
Good morning, Chair Holmes, members of the board. In your packet, you have amendment number 2 to the overall work program and budget for this fiscal year, 2018-2019. The amendment is very similar to amendment number 1 that was approved by the board in October of 2018, with a focus on project implementation and core agency activities. I'm just going to briefly walk through some of the main changes in the work elements between amendment number 2 and amendment number 1. We first have added work element 21, which is the Regional Transportation Plan Public Outreach. Caltrans requested that we separate out the $30,000 grant that we previously received, so we've done that. We have work element 23, which is the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency. We've added in funding for the Sierra College Transit Bus Pass Study. And then work element 45, that's our corridor mobility plan. And the board previously approved funding to move forward with that plan and also to pursue Senate Bill 1 grant funding. Then we have work element 60. This is the regional transportation funding strategy, and we've updated that to reflect the board-approved budget for the funding strategy consultant. And then lastly, we have work element 80. This is the Freeway Service Patrol, and we've received some additional funding from Senate Bill 1, and so we've added that to the budget. And you'll see in the document that the budget does balance, and with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Luke. Any questions from agency board members? I see none. Does anyone in the audience wish to address the board on this item? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the board for approval, authorization. Is there?
Approval?
Okay. It's been moved and seconded to authorize the executive director to adopt resolution number 19-02, approving the fiscal year 2018-19 overall work program and budget amendment 2. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none. Thank you. We'll now move to item L, appointment of Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority representative from the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency Board.
Just very quickly, Mr. Chair and members of the board, wanted to just highlight that this is, with the retirement of Mayor Rohan and Mayor Powers, we have a vacancy in the Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority representatives for both a permanent member, in addition to yourself, Mr. Holmes, and an alternate. We've spoken to Mayor Allard, who is willing to supply the permanent seat, and to Mayor Mackey, who is willing to serve in that alternate seat. And so we are making a recommendation to you for them to fill those seats. Just highlight the importance, especially this year and in the next coming years, of these appointments. We are right in the middle of the third track project, phase 1 for design and construction, a very critical year for that project, which takes us to from 2 trains to 6 trains per day to Roseville Station and all the issues surrounding that. And then we are working very hard through the Placer Sacramento Congested Corridor Mobility Plan to try to get funding for Phase 2, which is, a $200 to $300 million project to go across the Sacramento River to get us to 20 trains a day. And then lastly, we are with Mr. Kotrosky, the executive director, retiring this year. It is a very, very critical year that we participate in the selection process to the extent feasible of hiring a executive director that has both the Valley and the Bay Area equally in mind when they move forward. So just wanted to highlight that, and that's all I have to report and answer any questions you might have.
Okay, any questions? Mike, does this mean that Director Allard will be the primary?
The second primary, so you'd remain as the first primary. John Allard would be the second primary, and then Mayor Mackey would be the alternate.
Okay, what are you looking at me for?
Well, I do not want to be the primary.
No, I just want to.
Your senior status.
No, I think that's a good solution. With that third track coming to Roseville, I think we need someone from Roseville, and then eventually it'll come to Auburn. And we know Mayor Mackey will work hard to try to push that forward. So is there anybody in the audience have any objection? Okay, then, I think this is the time where someone makes a motion.
I will second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve item L, appointment Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority representative from the PCTPA Board. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, any abstentions? Hearing none, we'll move to item N, Transportation Funding Outreach Polling Update.
Good morning again, and I am going to, if you will, set the stage for a presentation by Kurt Balo with FM3, who is also partnered with our outreach strategy consultant, FSB Core Strategies. Kurt will be making a comprehensive presentation on the results of our first polling. But very quickly, wanted to really highlight the importance of this. And as we are at the very beginning stages of our outreach strategy, we certainly hired our team to move forward. We're starting some very active activities around the funding strategy, but this is the beginning spot where we're taking a look at what is our objectives, where do we stand in terms of the electorate that would be in a proposed South County district, and then what are the key messages that resonate with residents and voters in our quest to determine if a half-cent sales tax measure in the south part of the county is the best alternative for the reasons we've heard in our prior presentations today in terms of need for transportation improvements, whether that's the most suitable method to pursue. And so at the beginning of today, we talk about where we're at in terms of this polling and where we have been, because this is the sixth or seventh poll that we've conducted related to transportation funding, starting way back in 2013 and 2014, leading up to the 2016 election, where we missed by 2 percentage points. We polled again in 2017, and then where do we stand in 2019 today? The key decision point for you will be in the spring of 2020, where we will poll again, and at that point in time, that is where this board makes the very important decision whether or not to place it on the ballot. So before you today is not a decision in terms of whether we go or no go. Today is merely an assessment of where we're at today, a discussion of where we're at today, where we need to go, and then that key decision-making point is coming up in the spring. So today there's no requested action of you today, but we would certainly like to have a discussion following Kurt's presentation.
All righty. Sir.
All right, good morning. Happy to be back here again, going over some recent survey results. I'm going to get my notepad out because invariably you'll have some questions, and I want to make sure I jot them down so I can get back to you after the fact. So I'm going to go through this presentation. Oops, looks like we still have the draft watermark on there. That's definitely FM3's fault, but we can take that off and send that back for distribution later. First, I'm going to go through just a little bit of our sampling approach here, which is very similar to what we did in the variety of surveys leading up to Measure M, but obviously the different nuance here is that we're looking just at the South Placer County region. So we took the different areas identified by the agency here, basically the 3 cities and 1 town, and then some of the unincorporated areas interspersed in between those different incorporated areas. And we focused in on interviews with voters just in those areas, voters who are likely to vote next November. So that would be November 2020. We also did we did 600 interviews in that South Placer County area. We also did some additional interviews in the town of Loomis to try to get a few more interviews in there because they represented roughly 3% of the overall electorate in South Placer, which would be too small of a number to, frankly, even put in any analysis. So we did an oversample there to get that a margin of error at least into sort of a respectable-ish range. But we did those. We weighted those back down to their natural proportions. So we have more interviews in Loomis that we could feel a little bit better about, sort of on par with maybe Lincoln and Rockland. But we didn't their opinions are not overrepresented in the overall results. It's sort of weighted back to their natural proportions. And so what that gives us here is roughly a 10% margin of error in Lincoln, Loomis, and Rockland, a little bit better in Roseville, and overall, for the entire region, a 4% margin of sampling error. So kind of keep that in mind. We did this slightly different than the prior surveys we did prior to M. Overall, our industry has been moving away from exclusively using telephone interviews, although there's still many instances where that's helpful. We did a blended approach here where some voters were sent an email and asked to take the survey online, and some were contacted via telephone. And we had a relative balance of those 2 communication modes, so we didn't introduce any mode bias by having too many people in one of those particular modes. And we wrapped up those interviews basically kind of in the latter part of February, middle of February. So with that, let me get to some of the findings here. We have some data points here, and we had a survey, as Mike referenced, in 2017 we conducted post Measure M. And a couple of the big questions I think that the different stakeholders, when we talked to Mike and his team and others about, that really wanted to answer here, where it was, does this different approach provide more opportunity for the agency and the county here? A 2017 survey suggested that. But also in the wake of the 2018 election, what kind of impacts might there be from that? Obviously, we heard about Prop 6 and SB 1. That was a very high-profile statewide campaign that there was a lot of communications about here in the county. Are there any impacts of that? And also, several of your different communities passed local finance measures in that election as well, and what were the impacts of those? So we are not only just looking at the sort of viability of the measure and some of the structural components that we've done in the past, but trying to figure out, is the general electorate's mood impacted by these other post-2018 election elements, and how might that impact something in 2020? So one of the things here is just the general optimism, pessimism type question, that old Gallup question, right direction, wrong track. When we did this asked the same question in 2017, there was a pretty optimistic county here. 73% felt like the county was headed in the right direction. That's down to 63%, which is still a very positive number, particularly if you asked how people feel like the state is going. It's not going to get anything that glowing. They're much more favorable numbers. But that's 10 points less optimistic than in 2017. That's not any more pessimistic. The wrong track numbers are about the same. So more people are kind of mixed around the fence. But that's one of our 4 first clues, that the electorate here compared to when we looked at this in 2017, not quite as positive about, generally about the future. And we'll see this kind of pop up in a few other times here. Another set of questions that we asked were general favorability of various different government agencies and some other stakeholders in this endeavor. So the blue bars are those who have a favorable opinion of the entity here, and dark blue being very favorable, light blue somewhat. And those brownish bars are those who have a unfavorable opinion. And we've summarized those on the right-hand side. And the different shades of gray are like, people who couldn't voice an opinion, or you see on the next slide, are just not familiar with the agency. So here we have the 4 different incorporated communities here. And we have some data points going back to 2017. And keep in mind, for Rockland, Lincoln, and Loomis, there's roughly a double-digit margin of sampling error here. But you see for Roseville, basically those numbers are pretty consistent and very positive. We've seen some drops in the favorable numbers for Rockland, Lincoln, and Loomis, and the unfavorable numbers have picked up a little bit there, so a little less of a potentially happier electorate there. Roseville, though, looks pretty consistent. And then that's sort of the different communities that this measure would be potentially placed in. But what about some of the other actors here? The board, several of which you are on, this agency, and then Caltrans and the High Speed Rail Authority. Other agencies that could be invoked in conversations about a new ballot measure here. Caltrans is viewed pretty favorably, not a lot of intensity. That dark blue bar is pretty small, but still you've got 3 out of 5 who have a favorable opinion of Caltrans. On the other end, almost the mirror image of that is the High Speed Rail Authority, where you have 55% of voters here who have an unfavorable opinion of them. And that, so that's a pretty different point of view. The Board of Supervisors and your agency opinions are generally positive, but those gray bars you see are pretty big. There's just a lot of voters here who don't have an informed opinion or don't feel comfortable voicing an opinion about either of those levels of government compared to the cities. People had opinions about the cities. County, a little less familiarity. So we'll get to the measure, but these are all sort of these contextual questions here. One question that's actually quite interesting is trying to figure out what voters consider to be the most pressing problems in South Placer County. What are the things that really they're focused on? And one of the ways that we approach this is we present, here's a bunch of things that people say are potential problems. You tell us how serious of a problem you think these are. And we throw in a few things that are very relevant to a transportation funding measure and a few other things that aren't, just as benchmarks to see what people care about. And the scale we use here is an extremely serious problem, very serious, somewhat, or not too serious of a problem. We have 2 extra sort of intensity categories on the serious problem because it's pretty easy to say, sure, that's a somewhat serious problem, but we really care about those who are on the extremely or very side. And so those are summarized on the right-hand side of the presentation. And you'll see there's a pretty clear top tier. Healthcare costs, waste and mismanagement in state government, that's important to hear about state government, and traffic congestion. So of these different items, and there's other things we could have asked about, but of these items, traffic congestion is in the top tier. You've got 2/3 of voters in South Placer County who feel like traffic congestion on freeways and highways is an extremely or very serious problem. So that is indicative of, okay, this is not something that has waned and is actually seen up there with something like healthcare costs. The state government thing is interesting too, because we ask about it at the local level and we'll see there's a bit of a difference there. A couple other items here is the state and federal taxes. About half aren't too excited about that. We asked a few other things here about long-term water shortages, which a few years ago was the top of a list everywhere in the state we asked. So now obviously we've had a couple wet winters, now wet spring. That's come down the list, and it's sort of helpful to see how some of these things are a little more volatile and some are more persistent. But you see the traffic congestion on local streets, that's 20 points less concerning than freeways and highways, which is not surprising. Moving a little bit further down this list, everything here is seen as an extremely or very serious problem by less than half of the respondents. And here's where you see waste and mismanagement and local government, way down the list, 20 points less than state government. Your voters here clearly have a much more, I'd say, critical opinion of state government than their local government. So that's something that's helpful when thinking about interacting with the community and ways to discuss your potential funding needs here. Potholes, we'll see elsewhere in the survey that road repairs do pop up here and there as a priority, but as a top of mind issue, it is definitely below something like traffic congestion. That's definitely like a top of mind thing for folks. In terms of amount people pay in local taxes, only a third felt like that was an extremely pressing problem here in the county, which was, I'm going to go back a slide here, which is, compared to state taxes, there's almost a 20-point difference there. So it's clearly people here don't like necessarily the state and federal taxes that they pay, and part of that may have to do with their distrust of state government. Local tax rates, about a third feel like that's really pressing, but it's not as concerning. But always keep in mind, which I don't think I need to remind you, for a 2/3 measure, all it takes is a third of voters to say, I am not going to support this, and a third of voters feel like local taxes are particularly pressing. That's something to keep in mind. A couple of these we did ask, actually a number of them in 2017, and you can see to the extent there's been some changes in those. Concerns about state government waste has gone up. Illegal immigration, while now a top tier issue, has popped up a little bit too. But the traffic congestion on local freeways and highways, even 2017, it certainly wasn't rosy, but now almost 10% more people feel like that's a very concerning problem. So that issue is one that continues to rise up the list of concerns here amongst voters. And not totally surprisingly, we asked this question in 17 as well, and the italicized language is the exact language that was either read to someone on the phone or presented online. How do you feel like traffic congestion's got worse or better in the last couple of years? Well, everyone thinks it's gotten worse. We're looking high and low to figure out who the 2% who feel like it's gotten better are and what their experience is. But 3/4 say it's gotten worse, including half who say it's gotten much worse. So it's clearly a problem. We've got multiple data points here, and this is the kind of thing where none of this is surprising, but if we saw for some reason some of these numbers drop or other issues really jump in front of it in terms of priorities, then that gives us a little bit of a glimpse as to the viability of something. Another thing, since there has been work, particularly on the 8065 interchange, we wanted to ask a couple questions about that. And this is a little bit of a tough thing to tease out in a couple questions in the survey, but one of our concerns is, well, how people are viewing this. Do they view it as, well, maybe they're already fixing things and we don't need to worry about it, or it's a real pain and I don't know what's going on with this. So we asked a couple of these questions here. Do you feel like the number of projects has gone up or down, increased in the last couple of years? And about half said there's more construction going on, but a third said, yeah, it's about the same. So it's just not something that there's a majority of voters here feel like there's just a ton of new work being done, but half do, but it's not an overwhelmingly held sentiment. Many just sort of probably drive around and say, well, I see construction here and there all the time. It feels about the same to me. But the next question we asked is, well, do you think that the completed work has had a positive or negative impact on traffic? And this is a little hard to tease out because when something is being built and worked on, there's always a negative impact on traffic. So we try to say the completed work, and a little hard to tease out. But you've got roughly a 3-to-1 ratio of folks who said the completed work has had a more of a positive to the negative impact. So we're sort of in this middle-ish ground where a number of voters were kind of unsure about that. And it makes sense because particularly the work on 8065 is only phase 1 of 4, so there's many other things to come. But this gives us a sense that there isn't well, they're already fixing the problem here. Clearly, that's not the case. We did ask about Measure M, too. Do you recall that it was on the ballot? And if you do recall it, do you remember how you voted on it? So 61%, so 3 in 5 said, yeah, I remember Measure M. Some of these voters may not have even lived here or been old enough to vote, but and about more remember voting yes for it. Those who are more likely to recall the measure tended to be those with a little bit higher levels of education, commuting households, just a feel for that. But interestingly enough, there was no group where like 80-90% of voters remembered M. So even amongst different subgroups here, there's still a pretty reasonable chunk of voters who don't recall it. Oops, pardon me. All right, so that's some of the contextual background, where voters' heads are, where traffic congestion issues stack up amongst other things. So now we're going to get into the actual measure itself and reactions to it. So this was the language for Measure M, the 75 words, and no one, not to remind anyone here, it got to, rounding here, it got to 64% countywide. If you just looked at this South Placer region, it would have been at 68% and it would have passed. So this is the initial sort of post-mortem analysis of Measure M. Well, let's try to look at a measure that just is in the South Placer region. So here's the language that we tested in this particular survey. So hypothetical 75 words. There are some similarities to the Measure M language, but it's different in that we're not talking countywide. We're very specific about the 4 different communities in which this would be applied and the work would be done. And there are some additional differences here where you have to include more financial information about the measure itself. So the difference here we sort of talked about broadly around the county, and here we got into the specific communities here, and we were at 66% yes, which is roughly at the where you need to be. You need to be at that 60, 66, 67%. As a crude rule of thumb, you'd want to be above the vote threshold. You'd like to exceed it by the margin of error of the survey if possible. And for a 2/3 measure, you'd like to have the intensity of the yes side be in the 40s. So you're kind of right around some of those thresholds. And obviously it's different in every community, and this is something that would be almost 2 years out. So a lot of things can happen, but you're sort of in that kind of range. And we have a slide and 2 in here that compare this to where prior survey research is.
That was my question.
Oh, you
So
got it.
wait till you show
We'll
it.
get to that, yeah. And you got about a third who said, no, I'm voting no. Not a lot of fence sitters here. The undecided leaners, those are folks who initially said, I don't know. And we pushed them a little bit, we're going to lean one way or another. There's only 7% of the electorate fell into that category who moved one way or another, and only 2 undecided. So sales taxes tend to be like this. It's not a complicated funding mechanism. People get it. There's either for it or not. They're for the priorities that are being spent on or not. So this is something that people made up their mind on. We tested language very similar to this in 2017, and we got an appreciably better response. So we tested that, and it was at 75% yes. Very similar language, same geographic area, but this is obviously was the summer before the 2018 election. And obviously many of your communities had local finance measures within your community, and there was a very high profile Prop 6 campaign. So there is definitely an electorate that is, by and large, things shouldn't have changed that much, sort of generally speaking, but they are a little less enthused about a sales tax measure than they were in 2017. I think the big outstanding question that, like Mike alluded to, we'd have to wait a year is this the kind of impact that's going to persist through 2020, or is it the kind of thing where you already have people forgetting about M, will people start forgetting about the Prop 6 campaigns come 2020, and we'll have to wait and see on some of those. And we'll have some additional slides to talk about that later. So looking at our measure in terms of just a couple key demographic categories here, anything that's highlighted in bold and red is a group where you got to about 2/3 or higher said they would vote yes on this measure. Men and women, not a lot of difference. Women a little more supportive. That tends to be the case for finance measures. By age, some pretty strong support amongst voters, particularly under 40. And then also you got to 2/3 amongst the oldest voters. Not surprisingly, there's a pretty traditional and predictable partisan reaction here where Democrats are the most supportive. But you still have majorities of Republicans indicating they vote yes to. Obviously, you've got a different vote threshold here. Looking at the different communities, the cities here, town, in respect to Loomis here, Lincoln was at 73%. It was the only place where we got above 2/3 in those different communities. Roseville, Rockland, and Loomis were all in those mid-60s range, which, if you remember back to the research that we had for leading in the Prop M, Measure M and Measure M itself, that was the range where everyone sort of fell. If you don't recall the measure, you're much more supportive of it. So I think there may be some issue of like that, something's buried in my head about that, and I have a strong opinion about it, and maybe it's not a positive one. We also asked an affordability question. Can you afford a 1/2-cent sales tax? And there's a clear correlation there as well. And we did ask a couple follow-up questions. So if a number of follow-up questions, but one of them was, if you are inclined to vote yes on this measure, tell us why. And as you might imagine, on the phone and online, you get like a variety of different comments that are sometimes concise and to the point and well thought out, and sometimes people throw out a bunch of things. And we do our best to categorize those, put them into some sort of groupings, but not perfect, because you can mention multiple categories, and it's and some of these may sound kind of similar. But if you look at these, there was clearly a top two things that stuck out, which is the road conditions and traffic congestion. We mentioned road repairs in those 75 words, so that's not entirely surprising, but those were the two big things that stuck out. We did the same exercise for no voters, and there was one thing that really stuck out here, which is just an anti-tax sentiment. So this is 50% of the third who said they'd vote no, said the reason that they would vote no is I'm just opposed to this taxes. Now, specific references to the gas tax so those next four categories were kind of similar. They're all different flavors of there is other tax revenue out there that could be spent on these purposes. Some of them are more specific about it. It's the gas tax. Some of them are a little more generic. But that seems to be like the second kind of tier of opposition is funds exist through other tax mechanisms. Why should we do this again? All right. So the next section, I think, is about 4 slides, and it is potential spending priorities. So this is ways the dollars could be spent. The short, pithy summaries that we use do not give the projects do them justice, but they're trying to just tease out priorities, very similar to the things that led up to Measure M, with a few differences. In some cases, we used a couple different ways to explain something to see which resonated stronger or which just people understood better, and we'll touch on a few of those. But the scale we used here is how important would it be for you that funds from this measure be spent on this particular category. So again, we look for the intense reactions. So extremely, very important are the blue bars. Where do those line up? And as a crude reference here, stuff that gets to above 2/3 and extremely very is probably the things that people most care about. And wow, surprise, surprise, it's the 8065 interchange top of the list there, where you've got 3/4 of respondents to the survey saying that's where money should be spent. And we looked at it a couple different ways. So in prior research, we talked about reconfiguring it, and that was one of the top spending priorities. But now in intervening years, some work has been done there. So we phrased it differently for half the sample, saying, well, continuing the work, we just didn't know if that would have an impact. It really didn't. It was just work on this interchange. Issues around safety, around particularly outbridges and those sort of things, that was continuing to be a top priority here. Widening 65, you see has historically been a top priority here too, dealing with the 65 issues. Something that's all these other items were pretty similar to prior research. One that's a little bit new, and I want to point this out, is the improving emergency responder access or reducing traffic congestion. That's something that I don't think the agency looked at a whole lot in the prior research, and it seemed to be something that did resonate with voters here. I think there's 4 slides here, so bear with me while I work my way through it. Now we're all at things that are still in that roughly 2/3 extremely very, but you see those dark blue bars are starting to get a little bit narrow, kind of around 30%. So widening 65, and we got a little more specific here, from Pleasant Grove all the way to Lincoln. Pretty good. We had a tick below this formulation we used here, which is just we're widening it in both directions. A little more generic seemed to resonate a little bit stronger. And when we talked about improving road safety, things are still towards the top of the list here. Here's where we see that response times. We talked about upgrading the roads to maintain the response times. Didn't seem to resonate as much as the traffic congestion is the problem, and that's what we need to address. And that seems to be something that makes maybe a little more intuitive sense to voters. We did ask a couple of specific ones that were just presented to voters in these communities. So for Loomis here, just the Loomis folks, we said, well, providing funds for road improvements in your community. So we'll see some differentiation here between how the 4 different incorporated cities and towns responded to that. Now we're getting below the 2/3 level here. Lincoln is just on the heels of that there. But when we start getting into really narrow specific things, well, the specific bottlenecks at Pleasant Grove Boulevard, those things, a little less of a priority. Still, mid-60s, see them as important spending priorities, but we're kind of a tick below this 80-65, dealing with 65 sort of things. And let's see, we talked generically about improving emergency responder access. Definitely down the list from when we explain why it's an issue. It may be you just have to connect those dots for some folks. The last slide here, and we have it's the first time we get a few items that actually were seen as extremely or very important by less than half of the respondents here, and almost all those had to do with transit services. You see Rockland, which is the one place where the providing funds specifically for Rockland really tested down the list compared to the other communities. But now you see those brown bars start to get much bigger. These were seen by voters in this survey as less important spending priorities. This is that question about can afford it or not. And so we're hovering around 2/3 of voters who said, yeah, I can afford that 1/2-cent sales tax. And we saw a pretty strong correlation with that and support for a measure. We did ask a couple other questions, digging a little bit into the transit issues. So we asked, if basically transit were expanded here in South Placer, how much more would you personally use it to commute? And about 2 in 5 said they would. For questions like this, where there's a little bit of a social desirable response bias here, we tend to focus a little more on the intense reactions. So if someone said, I'd be much more likely, that's probably pretty real. And maybe we discount some of those who say somewhat more likely because they're just think that that's the right thing to say. But you're sort of in that range where probably a majority would say I wouldn't, or I'm not entirely likely to, but somewhere between maybe 20 to 30%, probably in that range, think they would. And obviously a lot depends upon what transit it is. We didn't dig into that. It's more of the gut reaction. And what was another question we asked here, which teases us out a little bit more, is we said, what's the best reason for investing more in public transit here? And we gave them 4 choices. Random order, pick the number 1 best reason and pick the second best reason. And these are the 4 categories here. And it really tiered into 3 chunks. The first tier was generically, county's growing, we need to expand transportation options. And that was definitely the clear number 1 reason, a little more sort of conceptual. Second and third reasons were pretty much equivalent, an environmental argument, and also that would make my commute easier. The fourth reason in a third tier is that my commute would be easier because I would use the transit. So there's a little bit of, and this is not uncommon, I hope that transit is expanded so other people will use it to make my commute easier. It's not exclusively the case, but that there's some sentiment there that's not uncommon in many places. All right, so we went through trying to simulate what might happen in a electoral context. We went through this with M. All of you are very familiar with the type of dialogue that happened in the community, and so we're trying to mimic that the best way possible in a survey like this to test the viability. I gave you some of those crude benchmarks for support at the beginning, initial vote, if something's viable or not, but it really depends also, like, if you push against it one way or another, what happens to that support or opposition? And so over the course of the survey, we went from 66%, and after going through pro and con arguments, this would be a great measure, this would be a terrible measure, we dropped down to 60%. And I'll see a slide in here later that shows that this has been the case with virtually every survey that we've done on the subject matter. We did something a little bit different in this survey than in prior ones. The sort of generic approach in our industry for doing these is that you do positive arguments first and then negatives. That's often sort of the sequence of something that a government agency puts on the ballot. In this case, we rotated it. So half got to hear, yay, this is a great idea first, and half heard, this is a terrible idea first. And we rotated that. So everyone heard both sets of arguments, but in different order. And we can see what the implications are in a moment. So one of the things that was interesting here is the initial yes vote versus the final yes vote. after hearing good idea, bad idea, Lincoln stayed pretty rock solid, frankly. They're sitting there basically the same level in the low 70s. Rockland and Roseville had drops, but Loomis really had the biggest drop there, and they really went from the 60s to the 40s. So that was a big place where there was the biggest decline. So I talked a little bit about the positive versus negative argumentation first and second. So for the half sample, they got the positive. Yes, this is a good idea. We need this. These are critically important things. Support got up above 2/3, got all the way up to 73%. But when negatives came back in, brought that back down into the familiar mid-60s range. When we said, well, here are reasons why this is a terrible idea first, support really dropped down in the 50s and never totally even got back up into the 60s after coming back with the positive. So there's clearly some impact of the order in which voters hear communications. Another potential indicator for viability here is you've got support levels and movement and everything, but is there what's this masking going back and forth? Maybe there's volatility, but it's in the same voters, or maybe there's a whole bunch going back and forth. And what we see here is even in the face of pro and con arguments, you've got a pretty consistent majority, mid-50s, who voted yes every single time in the survey. We asked them 3 times, how would you vote? Yes, yes, yes. And then you got another quarter who are like, no, 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 no matter what they heard. So that's your probably the ceiling floor sort of ish range, at least at this point in time. You're going to have half, a little more than half, who will always vote yes, and about a quarter, no matter what you say to them, are going to vote no. So you're looking at this 21%, just 1 in 5 voters who are going to determine the fate of this. Would it be put on the ballot? Going to your I think the question that we anticipated, which was, well, how does this compare to past polling results? So for leading up to Measure M, we did 3 surveys here for the agency before it was placed on the ballot, which was in July of 2016, and then a couple after it was placed, for the private context here. And you'll see that the initial support for a measure, and a couple of those in like 2014 weren't even ballot language, it was more conceptual as we were trying to tease out different mechanisms here. Support was always in the low mid-60s and always fell to the 50s after going through pro and con. Your agency still put something on the ballot at that point in time, and those numbers, while there was some volatility after we actually had final ballot language, it was kind of in that ish range and ended up at the final outcome, which is 64% rounding. So this 2000, now we're looking at just South Placer County, slightly different ballot language, post-2016 election. So we had that one survey we did in 2017 where we are at 75%, which was a much stronger starting point than any point before. And even after pro and con, actually we're still above 2/3. This survey went from 66 to 60. So it looks like in the context historically that as of this moment in time, a measure in South Placer County along these general contours is starting off at a better spot than any of the stuff before Measure M was placed on the ballot. Higher initial starting point, better after pro and con arguments. But it is not where the support levels were conceptually in 2017 before the 2018 election. So we're somewhere between, if you have like the Measure M world and you have this really great case scenario, which was 2017 world, where things are now somewhere in between there, at least from the research we've conducted as a data point. And the big question will be, what does this look like 2020? Do we stay in that same spot, or do we move up or down? Going through some of the pro and con arguments, this is a ton of text. I'm not going to sit here, and they're all in the packet materials here. A whole bunch of arguments in favor of the measure, a whole bunch of more arguments against it. A lot of them are about the exchange, the interchange, and different varieties of describing that. 65, just traffic, and we had some specific messages that were arguments that were, hey, in Loomis, here are the specific things that could be improved in your community. Went through each of the 4 different cities like that as well. Talked about the matching funds. We talked about emergency responders, the fact that it's only going to cost $5 a month for the average person, the fact that other people outside the community are going to pay a substantial portion of this. And then we said, for each of these, how convincing of a reason is this to vote yes? We do the same on the no side. And what we're looking at here is the percentage who said each of these arguments was very convincing or somewhat convincing. So we look at the aggregate level and then the intensity. And there was kind of a top tier. So there was 5 arguments that were seen as at least somewhat compelling by 3/4 of the respondents, and the intensity level is in the 40s somewhere. And it is about the interchange, any way you slice it, frankly. It's about Highway 65 and just general traffic arguments. Some just, it's traffic, and they've got these 2 big problematic areas, and those things resonated the strongest. Many of these other things were still seen as compelling reasons to support a measure, that the intensity just drops off a tick there. Moving further down this list here, you see arguments like, well, someone else is going to pay this. No one really thought that was particularly compelling. Roseville, who recently just passed a local measure that talked a lot about fixing roads, that was not a particularly compelling argument in that community. Compared to, in Loomis, you still had 74% who thought that was somewhat compelling. But you see, getting into some of these other nuances weren't quite as overall compelling as the just fix the traffic, particularly in these two really problematic areas. So this is the other side. This is why this is a terrible idea. We want to see what the impact of this could be. And many of these are themes that you heard during the Measure M community dialogue here. And some of these we added some things were a little bit different. So the gas tax argument has been one that we've consistently looked at, and we really wanted to see what the impact of that was, obviously. We also added some high-speed rail suddenly popped up again as a big issue, and certainly in the context of the state and federal government interactions. We wanted to see, that's a new sort of thread that we want to pull on there. Also, this concept that there's growth and development, shouldn't the developers be paying for these things? Another new sort of thing to explore. And then also we wanted to be very transparent and say, well, your community, particularly if you passed a local finance measure recently, just did this, we can't afford to do another tax. So we have a couple of these specifically for Loomis, Rockland, and Roseville. And also went through, it's going to hurt the local community, general anti-tax measure, invoking Measure M, saying, why are we doing this again? And noting that it's not really necessary. Clearly there's money somewhere else. We have other priorities that we should pay for. And used exactly the same scale. And there was a very clear tiering here, and the number one thing was the gas tax. So you had 85% of voters thought that was at least a compelling reason to vote no on this measure, including 60%. So that was very convincing. This was very, very, compared to the positives, nothing got to that level here. Whole bunch of other things in that second tier here, where you're sort of in the 2/3 aggregate reason, convincing. I was invoking Loomis's, and this probably explains a lot of why Loomis support dropped down, invoking some of the recent measure passed there, talking about high-speed rail, and the developer should be paying for this stuff, and the general concept of there should be other money out there. And this is something we saw in the open-ended questions as well. Saying that it's a Measure M was already voted down, we shouldn't do this again, that didn't really move the needle a whole lot. I'm saying that this is unnecessary, there's other priorities, the county clearly has money because they're already working on these interchange. Those weren't compelling reasons to vote against it either. It was very much focused on anti-tax sentiment. And one of the things that was interesting for us to look at here is the Prop 6 impact. It's hard to really exactly measure that out, but we used a very similar gas tax argument in the 2017 survey, and it was the most compelling argument then, as it was in prior years. But how compelling of an argument that is has gone up from 2017 in a notable fashion. From 51 to 60%, very convincing, 77 to 85%. So it was already a compelling reason to oppose the measure, and it was more so. The question is, where does that stand next year? So, last couple slides here. Voters can not only continue to be frustrated about traffic here, their frustration seems to be growing. And it's traffic congestion on highways and freeways is a more pressing problem for them than it has been in the past. They understand there's been some work that's being done here, and by and large feel like it's had some positive impacts, but it is certainly not enough in their minds. The real hotspots are the interchange and generally 85, and that seems to be prior research we conducted leading up to M and everything we've done now, that's still the real top priorities there. In terms of expanding transit, there's a variety of different factors for people wanting to potentially support that, but it seems like it's the hope that it gets people off the roads. And recall for M, I bet you we do this survey next year, well, it's going to continue to drop down. I think it's going to fade into the background a little bit. But in terms of viability here, this is something that, given the 2/3 vote threshold, it is easy to think about, well, this measure was rejected by voters. Well, you still had a pretty consistent, 64% said they vote yes for Measure M last go-around. And this research suggests there is still a very solid majority of voters would vote yes for a similar measure in South Placer counties. But that 2/3 vote threshold, as you know, is challenging. And we did see a spot where there's a path where support could exceed that, but we also saw that the exchange of communications, then that support could be eroded as well. So you're starting in that spot, probably somewhere between Measure M and between like the high water mark that we saw in 2017. And as I noted a couple times here, it feels like the big question is, and I think we clearly saw the impact of Prop 6, is where are voters' heads here in South Placer County come next year. Is that still an open sore that's being pushed up against? Is it something that, well, that's the law of the land, we're sort of used to it now, let's think of this as a separate issue that we want to address. The traffic congestion is such a big problem. Let's look at this as an isolated thing we want to weigh the pros and cons on. And that's why I think Mike noted that it's the kind of stuff that we want to investigate next year. So that's a lot of me talking and going through a bunch of numbers here. But that concludes the presentation.
Thank you for that very comprehensive presentation. Any comments from directors, agency directors? Yeah, Jan. And there's a little button down on the side, no, down below, down below.
Thank you very much for that. It's a lot of information. I would love to get my hands on that entire presentation if you could please share it with us. I think it would have been helpful too to maybe have that before we came, just because it has a lot of information on it. The town of Loomis, we have a lot of problems with our roads, and we have, I think a great need to fix those roads. And of course, our townspeople obviously has shown that it's important to them as well. Town of Loomis leadership is committed to, letting our people know about the measure that's up and coming. It's hugely important to us. Looking at the polling, I can see that some of the opposition was talked about the measure that was just passed. And then I could see that our votes went the other direction. So when you redo the poll, are you going to do different questions? Is it going to be repeated the same way? How's that going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this will do with the conversations we have with the agency and everything, but a lot of these questions will be pretty similar. I think you'd want to take into context anything that's changed between now and then. We don't know how everything's going to, there could be a recession. There could be a lot of external factors that come up. I think in general, voters' memories about finance measures or ballot measures, period, tends to be rather short. So we might still want to ask those questions, invoking the 2018 measures, just to see if that has changed or not. I've moderated focus groups 2 weeks after a big statewide election, asked them about campaigns that tens of millions of dollars were spent on, and like a bunch of people say, yeah, I voted in the election. Do you remember what prop whatever was about? I don't remember. So that happens a lot. Now at the local level, it may be different because you can tangibly see what's going on there as opposed to some nebulous statewide measure. And I think that will be a big part of trying to figure out whether something is viable or not. And what the viability stands at is how much voters sort of still have these things in the back of their mind.
Okay. So you'll send me the presentation?
Yeah.
Yes, we will.
Thank you.
Director Wright, did you have a comment?
I do. So I know that this is a measure focused on South Placer County. If the polling, the next round of polling kind of shows very similar polling numbers, is there ever a consideration of going back out to a county-wide sales tax measure.
That is clearly a discussion that we would have to have. And there has also, been some changes, for example, in the legislation for the Tahoe Basin. So we'd have to carefully look at that to see if, where was the Tahoe area at in terms of a measure. But yeah, that is a discussion that we will have at this point in time. I don't know how much. I'm skeptical of if it would be better, but certainly we can have that conversation.
Yeah, I guess I just hope that we do. Looking at other jurisdictions who have gone for sales tax measures, it definitely has taken them more than one try. I think countywide, we pulled really high. The Tahoe Basin was hard because of the language in the measure and in the ballot. A lot of confusion for us, although there was a good deal for the Tahoe Basin within Measure M. It was hard for the voters in our community to see that when they read the measure. So, I don't know. It's just a good idea to keep that on the table as well.
Sure.
Thank you. Mayor Mackey.
Yes, I specifically wonder why. I realize that Auburn and Colfax were left out of the equation because of the results of the last measure. But considering the polling that's being done for South Placer, it's changed some. Was there no thought in including Colfax and Auburn in the polling this time? And why not?
Our board made that decision unanimously, essentially because the areas north of Newcastle were 20 to 30 percentage points off of a 2/3 majority, so it was very significant, the difference in the numbers, and so that's why that decision was made, that we would have the highest likelihood to have something in the South County, with the thought, and our board also added that in the future, we could look at a mid-county or north part of the county sales tax measure. We also, the board made a decision to, in concept, to shift $2 million of Transportation Development Act funds to those areas that were not going to be in the measure as well, so that they wouldn't be left out, if you will, with no funding for their project. So that was also unanimously approved by the board. But again, we can as we move forward to spring of 2020, we can take a look at this again. But I guess to answer your question, it was because it was so far off in terms of the rest of the county that it wasn't an insignificant number, that from Newcastle north, 20 points off of 2/3 majority.
I'd be interested to see the polling from 2017, how it compared to the results of the election.
It would be actually before that. We did, in 2017, we polled for the South County only.
Okay, well, the polling for
The 2016.
2016.
the 2016 measure, I'm sorry, yes.
The actual election would be the last data that we have, and then
Yeah, that's what it is.
maybe about 6 months before that would be the last poll for the countywide.
So how did the polling compare to the results for the Colfax Auburn area?
I have to go back and look at that. I don't have that. I don't fit my fingers.
Thank you.
Any other questions from board members? Is there anyone in the audience who would like to address the agency board on this item? Seeing none, what are next steps?
So we also attached a revised expenditure plan for the measure, reflecting the new sales tax projections that were done by HDL companies in concert with the finance directors of the South County jurisdiction. So roughly about a $1.32 billion number. Excuse me, a $1.36 billion number. We revised those two ways. One was that there, of course, some of our regional projects have gotten more expensive, so we adjusted those numbers. But we also adjusted the money going to each city and local jurisdiction down from 30% to 25%, and couple reasons for doing that. One is to balance the funding we had, but also in respect to SB 1, we now do have a source of dollars for road rehab, and we should be very clear that there are two, and that's part of our outreach moving forward, is that we have essentially two pots of money, SB 1 for Fix It First, repairing our roads, and this is for planned expansion. And so we thought an adjustment from 30% to 25% was warranted, as well as a focus with those local dollars on expansion projects versus road rehab to reflect what was in the polling, and again, so that you don't have this perception that there's double counting or double dipping, if you will, between the two pots of money. So we made that adjustment. So we'll be actually back to you at the next meeting for you to have a good, healthy discussion on the expenditure plan, but we wanted to present that to you today so you can have the next 30 days or so to take a look at that and then have a good discussion. We'll now move forward full gear into our outreach strategy. We've been working with FSB Core Strategies essentially to get the tools ready, but now what we will do based upon the transportation polling is now drop the messages, the key messages into those types of things and fully implement those things and put those into high gear in very short order. Two things I'd like to highlight is one is that we are working with our emergency service providers. We have a lot of anecdotal and polling data to say emergency response time is a key issue for this information phase of our work. But what we really want to do is actually do a real analysis on that, and so we're working with a traffic firm that works with us on a number of projects, as well as our emergency service providers within our communities to actually say, okay, well, what would happen to emergency response with or without these improvements in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And then we're also going to take a look at what are the effects of traffic congestion. Again, instead of just anecdotal things, how does it affect our economy? How does it affect the health of the community? So those are two areas that we are proceeding ahead, and that you'll see things coming back to you on your board calendar as we need your approval to enter into agreements to do that work. So,
Okay, good. All righty. Thank you very much for the presentation. And now we'll move to item N, the Executive Director's Report.
for the sake of time, as we knew we were going to be running long, we actually did the Executive Director's Report in printed fashion. It's actually on page 53. So I'll save the time if you have any questions on any of those items. I did want to highlight one thing that didn't get in the report, and that is Caltrans. You might have noticed they turned on their ramp meters for Highway 65. They're going to turn on in the next few weeks the ramp meters all day long, from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and that's because it hit a traffic threshold for 80/65. And a roadway, when it hits that threshold, it must turn those meters on. But that really is a measure of that traffic is not flatline increasing, it's actually exponentially increasing for Highway 65. And about 50 minutes ago, there was actually a large article in Sacramento Bee on that, so you might look at that. So with that, I'll conclude my report.
All righty. Any board direction to staff? Seeing none, you have information items that you're in your packet if you wish to look at them. Our next regularly scheduled PCTPA meeting is April 24th, and we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.